which was where the library of the Indians was hidden. She gave him some instructions, and he followed her lead, and he arrived into like a tunnel depression, where he began unearthing artifacts that contained scripted images that for him reflected ancient writing. The images were of anthropomorphic shape, so he termed them anthropoglyphs. And he tried to decipher the symbols that appeared in these stones. Um, After he began working with the materials, he arrived to the conclusion that the writing represented in the stones was of Hebrew Chaldaic origin. And so he associated these stones to the lost tribes of Israel. And obviously, he got a lot of resistance when he began presenting this idea. But there were, different researchers coming to the Americas and Puerto Rico specifically, looking for information. And one of them was Alphonse Pinard, who was commissioned by the French government to come to the Americas and look for ancient languages, and also to buy archaeological materials. And he was really famous. He bought the crystal skulls. He was the one that brought them to France. And these are the ones that appear in the Indiana Jones movies. And so things that he got together with the priest, and this is the earliest evidence that we have anything written about the stones. He got together with the priest sometime between November of the year 1880 and February of 1881, and he saw the stones, and he was the first one to really make an interpretation. He said that the first ones that the father found were authentic, but then that the people from the town, when they saw that the priest was really interested in this, some began replicating some of them. So he posed a situation where we have some stones that are authentic and others that are replicated. And so recently, I've been researching this collection and been able to identify that the largest collection remaining outside of Puerto Rico is actually in the Duquois Museum in France, in Paris. And this guy brought the stones. They have 38 of the stones of Father Nazario there. I actually saw some of his ancient pictures, the drawings, and compared it with modern artifacts that are there. And he is important not only because he mentioned that some of these stones were authentic, but also, as is mentioned in the documentary that we just saw, which is really great, by the way, he mentioned the only information that we have thus far on the specific provenience of this stone. And I just got this document from the museum in France. And it says, that the stones come from Puerto Rico, Región de Janoa. And that's what was being mentioned, that thus far the only area that I have been seeing related to this name is associated, to the lands of the tribe of Ephraim. And so, Pinard kept on being interested in the stones. I just found this letter that was written by Father Nazario in 1908. This is around 28 years later than what he first met with the priest. And it talks about a letter that Pinard wrote to the priest from Paris. And I haven't been able to locate this letter, but to me it is quite possible that it provides an additional interpretation by Alphonse Pinard of this collection. And the collection has intersected with some of the leading figures on the history of Puerto Rico. And so you as Boricuas, I will mention some names that will really resonate with you. The best friend of Father Nazario was this guy, Manuel Seno Gandia. And Manuel Seno Gandia is credited with writing the earliest novel in Puerto Rican history, La Charca. You know, we are all told in the school to read this novel. And so in the year 1881, Seno Gandia was brought to Spain to celebrate the centennial of Calderón de la Barca. And so the priest gave him 2 stones so that he took to Spain to show them there. And so the priest told him, please don't get rid of these stones. You know, these are really important. So when he went to Spain, he met with one of his professors, and who was actually the founder of the Anthropological Museum of Madrid. And the professor, when he saw stones, said, please just give it to me, you know, give me one of them. So he gave one of the stones to his professors, and then Seno Gandia came back to Puerto Rico. And Father Nazario was really mad because he was really attached to these stones. So when this novel, La Charca, was being written, the first draft of the novel contained a character that was a priest, but it was a really humble priest, not very knowledgeable. And so Seno Gandia showed that draft to Father Nazario. Father Nazario was, you know, really mad about the way that he portrayed the priest. The priest. So then Seno Gandia changed, you know, the character of the priest, the way that it was being conveyed. You know, and he showed it again to Father Nazario, and then Father Nazario said, okay, you know, now as a priest is more like me now, so you are forbidden about the issue of the stone. And so, you know, these issues in terms of Puerto Rican history are very important because, as we will see, you know, many of these stones began being dispersed as the lost tribes of Israel across the different museums of the world, some of the great museums of the world, you know. And some of them, even though we have primary evidence that they were put in the museums, I went through the catalogs, and right now some of these stones are lost. So when the priest got the stones, he bought a house. And I found the record of the time he bought the house. You know, it was a house of this type of architecture, really typical in southern Puerto Rico. And I began finding evidence that this house served as a museum where he located the stones. And he brought people in, and we're talking about Román Valdoriotti de Castro, Agustín Estal, you know, the father of Puerto Rican science. They met with him, and they all saw these stones. So this was really an important issue. Actually, Father Nazario wrote a book. It was really a revolutionary book, talking about where did Columbus land in Puerto Rico. And he thought that the place where Columbus landed was not in the west, as usually was thought, but it was in the south of Puerto Rico. And he thought that the location of Columbus landing spot was there because Agüeybaná lived there, because his stones were there. And so when Father Nazario presented that idea, the island of Puerto Rico, you know, this was in the commemoration of the 4th century of the supposed discovery of Puerto Rico in 1893, and the island basically divided in two. You had the people that thought that Columbus had arrived through the south, and the people who thought that he came from the west. And so there's like lines like this, you know, desde que el Padre Nazario, con licencia del obispo, dando a los bienes reinantes su folleto colombino, se armó la marimonera y se despertó el prurito de rectificar con R la historia de Puerto Rico. This was like a major event in the history of Puerto Rico, and the stones were featured prominently there. So by that year, 1893, we have the first evidence of a book, of what I call the lost manuscript, that was written by the Father Nazario about the stones, where it contained his idea that the stones represented remains of the lost tribes of Israel. You know, it was called Escritura Aborigen de Carib. And so another person that got into the mix, you know, is Cayetano Colitoste. Cayetano Colitoste is basically one of the fathers of Puerto Rican history. And so the Father Nazario went to Cayetano Colitoste and asked him, hey, I'm trying to interpret these stones, can you help me? And Cayetano Colitoste lived in San Juan. Father Nazario lived in the south of Puerto Rico. And so Cayetano Colitoste said, well, yes, send me the stones, and I'll study them and then I'll give them back to you. And basically the priest never did it because he didn't want to get rid of the stones. But I have some additional reference, that it was during this time that he began to refine some of his ideas about the writing that was present in the stones, and his notes that this was a Hebrew Chaldaic type of writing. And even though we don't have the manuscript, we have ideas derived from presentations that were eventually put out in the press that contain small summaries of the ideas that he was developing at that point. And so he wasn't the only one saying that the indigenous people of the Caribbean had relationships with the lost tribes of Israel. Actually, by the year 1889, Leonfroy de Toron wrote another book, talking about the Phoenicians having influence on the people of Hispaniola. So this was an idea that was really being actively thought after. But as the documentary that we just saw presented, there is this scientific establishment that really is the one that provides the basis for what is accepted, in the scientific spectrum. And so in the year 1903, Jesse Walter Fuchs from the Smithsonian Institution went to Puerto Rico, and he met with Father Nazario. And he actually said that the Father Nazario collection was the best collection, that there was in Puerto Rico at that time. And he tried to purchase the collection from the priest, At that time still you had 800 pieces. But as you see in his field notes, he was saying that the stones were supposed to be fakes. And basically, he also began, he saw the manuscript of Father Nazario. And the manuscript says that these are related to the lost tribes of Israel. So we really know from a primary source that Father Nazario was dealing with this idea. But, even though he thought that the stones were fakes, he got some back. And they are now in the Smithsonian Institution stored, so, you're saying that the stones are fakes, but you still got them, right? And so you see the museum entry records, and I've tried to go to primary sources to address this issue because I am trying to do it, from an academic stance. And he puts them, he labels them as fakes. But, and that right now, even up till today, is the stance that has been adopted by the scientific community in Puerto Rico and in general. By the year 1905, another reporter went to interview Father Nazario, and he had another draft of the book. By this time it was called Escritura Fonética de los Indios de Puerto Rico, o sea, el Caldaico Hebreo. So he was still thinking that this had to do with Hebrew Chaldaic scripts. He was using this book, Chaldea, written in 1889, and as I mentioned before, the stones were already there by 1880, 1881, so he couldn't have used this, which is, demonic bowl, which has a type of writing, some signs that had messages that were supposed to be put face down to stop the demons from coming out of the earth, right? And so he was using this to interpret what was being said on these stones. And on the basis of all of this information, the priest said that some of the lost tribes of Israel, at least a branch of them migrated east into Siberia, then came through the Bering Strait, and that at some point, after reaching Central America, the brightest branch fled into Puerto Rico, and establish the brightest lamps. And this is in his own words, you know. I don't blame him. I'll take that. Fled into Puerto Rico and got in contact with the indigenous people, and this was, he mentioned that this was Hebrew priests, you know, that had moved. These priests were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and that they had come to Puerto Rico and interacted, you know, with the societies there, and this information has been exchanged that way. By the year 1911, the priest goes, he got sick, he goes into the Obispado in Old San Juan, and he gets a visit from this guy who was the official historian of Puerto Rico, Adolfo de Hostos. He's the son of Eugenio Maria de Hostos. So if you're Puerto Rican and you don't know who Eugenio Maria de Hostos is, you have a big problem. And so he was the one that actually coined the term Piedras del Padre Nazario. And he read the manuscript, so the priest still had the manuscript. He was trying to get it out, and my hypothesis is that he didn't publish the manuscript because he was being restricted, because he already had the information. We know that the manuscript already existed by the year 1893, at least a first draft, and we're talking that by 1915, when Adolfo de Hostos went to visit him, he still wasn't able to publish the manuscript. One interesting thing was that Adolfo de Hostos, even though he was, you know, moving back and forth about his opinion on the stones, he took one stone and he sent it to the British Museum. And he got information back, and the information that he got from this guy who was one of the curators of the cuneiform room, CBF Walker, was that the stone was actually quite ancient. You know, he talks about Sumerian tablet, 2000 BC. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily fit with the idea that the priest was putting, but actually it at least says that the stone was actually authentic. And then after that, you know, the British Museum seems to have kept the stone. And then also, these stones that many people think are fakes, you have others that are in the Peabody Museum of Harvard University, you know. There is other lady, she was a teacher from Puerto Rico, that she also was Mrs. Santiago, Alice de Santiago. She was trying to get collections and sell them to the Smithsonian. You know, actually a different stone was supposed to have been found in northern Puerto Rico, in the town of Barceloneta, which is supposed to be this one that is being presented here. And it's quite important because then it says that this is an independent finding of the stones of Father Nazario. And so I have this letter from Seno Gandia, between Seno Gandia and this lady. This is in 1925. And Seno Gandia was the editor of Father Nazario. So anything that the priest wrote, Seno Gandia read it. So this letter basically says that the Father Nazario died thinking that the stones were original. Actually, we have records of him when he got sick. He was moved to the Obispado in Old San Juan. He took the stones with him and put them under his bed, you know? So for someone that had perpetrated a hoax, this is a really interesting behavior, you know? And so the collections began moving back and forth. We have in the Junghans collection, big collection from Puerto Rico, and the collection that was left. We have, thus far in Puerto Rico, I have them in my lab, around 270 stones, were purchased by Ricardo Alegría. Ricardo Alegría, well, you know, he's the founder of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. He's actually the architect of our current notion of who we are culturally as Puerto Ricans, you know? The idea that we're a blend of the Spaniards, and the Spaniards being the mother culture, you know, this Eurocentric view, you know? This was articulated by Alegría. And Alegría was the main enemy of the stones, you know? He that's why we don't know about the stones. That's why we as Puerto Ricans, when we go to school, the stones don't exist for us, you know. And so he never wrote anything about the stones. He just bought them and hid them. And this is the only part, you know, that makes reference to the stones. You know, this is from an article from El Nuevo Dia.
August
And
17,
basically it says that
1980.
the stones, well, there's no evidence that they are authentic. He was in disagreement with this guy. He was the president of the History Association, of the History Academy of Puerto Rico, Aurelio Tio, who actually thought that the stones were authentic. And he was the one that really made many of the important studies on the stones. He brought them to the press, and he tried to get expertise from different scientists. But he ran into the same problems that I have. And that is that there are some people that they just don't want to deal with it. You know, they just don't want to, you say, please, can you analyze them? You know, that's all. Tell me they're fakes, you know, but just look at them. And they just don't want to deal with them. So he had to recur to this guy, Barifel. And, you know, he was a professor of Harvard, but he was a marine biologist. He was not an epigrapher. But he had some ideas, you know, and he began saying that the scripts in the stones are related to ancient Basque writing. And that this arrived to the Americas and merged with the symbols that the Incas had in their tocapos or their robes, right? And that in combination to what was mentioned in the documentary, the Biblioteca Nacional de Ecuador, you know, from Father Crespi, he used all that evidence to begin translating some of the stones, right? So he got the symbols in the stones, thinking that they were ancient Basque words expressing phonetically Inca speech. So it's a really complicated and convoluted explanation. But he began supposedly translating some of the stones, and he came up with these literal translations. And you know, the thing is that Barifel was a really controversial researcher. So he got the idea that at some point these groups had migrated from the Middle East, you know. They had gone down South America, you know, at some point met with the, you know, people in the area of Peru, you know, merged. So then they continued moving, eventually arriving into Puerto Rico, leading to the presence of these stones. And that is a really complicated maneuver, you know. When you look at it scientifically, you know, and you say, well, you know, wouldn't this be easier? You know? Why isn't that possible, you know? You have to go through all that trouble. So at this point, I'm dealing with three hypotheses, you know? One, that the stones are fakes, you know? And if these are fakes, let me tell you, this would be the largest forgery perpetrated in the 19th century in the Americas by a Catholic priest in rural southern Puerto Rico. that the stones are authentic, as Father Nazario said, and that some stones are authentic while others are fakes, you know? So basically, I'm in this situation, you know, I'm this one right here. I'm trying to see, you know, what's up. So I'm going at it, you know, with science, with the language of nature, you know, supposed to be reflected on it. And so I'm looking at, for instance, where did they get the stones?
Dr.
Where did
Pablo
they get the raw materials to make the
Lilirani,
stones? Let's start from
Dr.
that. You
Pablo
know?
Antonio
And
Martinez.
so I'm working with some really, really good Puerto Rican scientists, you know, Boricua, Pablo Gerandi, a geologist, and we have gone to the field to look for the stones. You know, we know what type of stone it is. It's serpentinized peridotite, you know. We're doing X-ray diffraction, X-ray fluorescence to characterize the stones and come to terms, you know, with the potential location. So the finding was supposed to be somewhere around here, and these areas in dark green are the areas where the type of raw material from which the stones are made is located. So although at present the results are not still conclusive, it is quite possible that the raw materials from where the stones were made is actually local from Puerto Rico. And that implies that the stones were made, that would imply that the stones were made in Puerto Rico. And so also, I've been going at the field because I'm an archaeologist, so everything needs to start from the bottom up. And so I've been looking at the references of the potential location where the stones were found, and I've been going at caves, talking to people from the area, and looking at symbols, engravings in that area. I'm beginning to find some interesting information that I'm not still, able to present because it's still tentative. I'm also working with the technology. How did they do the stones, right? And I'm working with Dr. Stefan Facchini from the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, and we're doing use-wear analysis where we're putting the stones to high magnification, and they are chiseled. This is really interesting because the techniques that were being used are not traditional indigenous techniques, So this type of chiseling is not traditional indigenous technology that we have seen in other materials in Puerto Rico. And we have seen some stones that are authentic and others that are definitely made in more recent times. So at this point, my perspective is that we actually have some stones that are authentic and others were made. They are archaeological because they already have at least 130 years. So they are part of our cultural patrimony. But they were made at the time of the priest. And so this doesn't diminishes at all the importance of the stones. Actually humanizes them, the way that they participated within the society. This is rural southern Puerto Rico, really poor people struggling to survive, and they see that the priest maybe have given them a cent or two to give it, so they did the stones. But then I've been analyzing weathering patterns in some of the materials, and I'm seeing the rounding in some of their sections. Actually, these stones seem to have been exposed to the elements for quite a while. They do not seem to have been produced 130 years ago, many of them. And so there are different types of beings represented in the stones. You can see some of the writing here, some of the writing there. And we're doing 3D scanning of the stones in order to be able to send them to different specialists that can allow us to determine, the different types of scripts that are represented. But the thing is that these are bodies, human bodies, and they are dressed. They are of a turban, and some of you, I see it, and I see your face there, You see the face is it's a triangular face. You see the turban going back, and it goes down to the neck too, It is similar to this type of turban, with some varieties, you see. It creates this triangular center, and it goes, so this also allows us to begin looking at, for me, the possible African origin of some of the ideas that are being expressed on these stones. I'm also doing some chronometric dating, and I have some news that this is you guys are the first to know. Last week, I got I took some stones that still had charcoal adhered to them. These are burnt, they have charcoal adhered. So this is associated to the time of their burning, and they are burnt after, the marks were made. So this that you see here, this is a potlet. It's a type of fracture that emanates from the stone when they are exposed to high temperatures. And you see a line that is interrupted because of that. So the stone was burnt after the line was drawn, right? So I got did radiocarbon dating of some of the stones, right? So I scraped some of the embedded charcoal on the stones in order to date them. So I just got the dates of two of them. One of them dates to AD 210 to 540. The other one 660 to 800. This is preliminary, but I believe that this is the most robust evidence that we have generated thus far on that the idea that these stones are actually authentic. You know, that they come from indigenous stands, you know, and this is the level of resolution of this is really high. There's no statistical possibility that this range extends into post-colonial or post-Columbian times. So this definitely dates to the indigenous period. And now I'm working with this guy, Christopher Ralston, trying to get him to help me do the epigraphic study of the stones to read what type of script is being represented there. Because I have an idea of what type of script it is. And I have a hypothesis. You know? I call it la ruta del gofio. You know, in Puerto Rico they say, tú estás comiendo gofio. And gofio is like a powder, you know, that you can make out of different materials. It's sweet, you know. When they say estás comiendo gofio, basically you're being lazy, you know. And so gofio, where does gofio come? Gofio comes from the Canary Islands. And I believe that the Canary Islands was basically perhaps a stopping point of groups moving from Western Africa, you know, possibly also the Southern Iberian Peninsula, you know, groups that eventually had come from the Middle East, you know, and that from there, you know, it's a straight route to the Antilles. How am I doing that? How am I getting that information? Well, I'm comparing materials. And I'm starting on the stones, and the stones not only have the script, but they also have a system of lines that for me is a sort of geodesic design, a type of map, you know? And so I've been looking at artifacts that have come from definite archaeological excavations that have the same signs in order to be able to correlate and make an argument that this type of information that you have seen, that you see here, you know, even with routes, moved lines starting at some points, moving into another, you know, that are found in archaeological sites. You know, this one actually we found excavating in my university in Utuado, you know, in the indigenous epicenter of Puerto Rico. And my students, they unearthed it. I'm glad that they were, because if it was me, then people thought I planted it, you know. And, but the thing is that it's not only that, but also we have it in caves, you know. We have it in bateys. This is in Utuado, and you see the same system.